Welcome to a fascinating journey through the strangest pages of world jurisprudence. Today we will talk about laws that will not only make you smile, but also reflect on how whimsical human logic can be. Imagine you wake up in the morning and discover that from now on it is forbidden to die, or that your favorite hat is outlawed. Absurd? Without a doubt. But such laws really did exist, and some are formally still in effect today. The history of legislation is full of surprising examples of how society tried to regulate citizens' behavior in the most unexpected ways. What was behind these strange prohibitions and prescriptions? What circumstances could have led to the emergence of laws that today seem completely ridiculous to us? And why have some of them still not been repealed? We will find answers to these questions in the next 30 minutes. Did you know that in many countries there are still laws adopted centuries ago? Jurists call them dormant laws. They are not applied in practice, but formally they remain in the legal field. Sometimes this creates surprising legal paradoxes. For example, in some states in America, it is technically illegal to carry ice cream in your back pocket on Sundays. This strange prohibition is an echo of a time when they tried to prevent horse theft this way. The cold treat attracted the animals that followed the person, and formerly this was not considered theft. So get ready to be surprised and amazed as we set out to explore 8 of the most absurd laws from different times and corners of the world. The first law worth talking about appeared in medieval England and concerned death. In the year 1337, the British Parliament passed a law that prohibited dying during sessions. Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? But behind this absurd prohibition, there was quite a practical logic for that time. The thing is, the Parliament building was considered royal property, and according to an old English custom, if a person died on the king's land, their body and properties became the monarch's property. This custom has its roots in ancient Anglo-Saxon law, where the principle of finders keepers applied. At sea, everything the sea cast onto royal land, including shipwreck remains, became the property of the crown. Later, this principle was also extended to cases of death. It's particularly curious that there was even a special position, the coroner, the royal coroner, whose duties included investigating each case and determining what part of the deceased's assets should pass to the crown. Imagine the situation. An important state meeting is taking place, and suddenly one of the deputies drops dead. By law, the funeral ceremony had to be organized by the king himself, which meant enormous expenses from the treasury. Moreover, the family of the deceased could lose a significant part of the inheritance, and in the medieval parliament, predominantly elderly nobles were seated. In the absence of modern medicine, in cold halls where in winter the temperature rarely rose above a few degrees of warmth, death from a heart attack or stroke was a very real threat. Historical records are preserved indicating that in the particularly harsh winter of the year, 1325, several members of parliament actually died during the debates. This case, according to historians, became the catalyst for the adoption of the absurd law. What happened if someone dared to violate this law and died right in the parliament? The situation became truly absurd. The parliamentarians would simply carry the dying person out of the building so they could take their last breath already on the street. Technically, the law was fulfilled and the family retained the right to the inheritance. In the chronicles, a case is described where an elderly lord felt the approach of death, and he himself asked to be taken out to the street, demonstratively declaring, "I will not give His Majesty the pleasure of inheriting my lands." This act of disobedience caused a real stir at court, but the king could do nothing with the cunning noble. Surprisingly, this law was never officially repealed, and formally remains in effect to this day, although of course in modern Britain. No one will punish a person for dying in an inappropriate place. The British Parliament, by the way, is famous for its conservatism. For example, until the 2000s, there was a ban on bringing armor and weapons into the chamber, an echo of medieval political intrigues. When the physical elimination of an opponent was a common practice, now let's move to ancient Rome, where there was an equally strange law about yawning. Yes. During the reign of Emperor Claudius, in the 1st century AD, it was strictly forbidden to yawn in public meetings. Offenders faced severe punishment, even imprisonment. Why were the Romans so afraid of a common physiological process? The fact is that in ancient Rome, yawning was considered a sign of boredom and disrespect toward the speaker. And in a political system where eloquence and public speeches played a key role, such a display of contempt could seriously undermine the speaker's authority. Moreover, there was a superstition that through the open mouth during a yawn, evil spirits could possess a bad person. Ancient Roman medicine, primarily based on the teachings of Galen, considered yawning as a dangerous symptom of an imbalance of the 4 vital fluids in the body. It was believed that a person yawned when there was an excess of black bile in their body responsible for melancholy and depressive states. And in public places, a melancholic person represented a threat. Their state could infect those present and cause mass apathy. The law was observed with particular rigor during the interventions of Emperor Claudius himself, who, as known from historical sources, suffered from stuttering and physical defects. Any indication that his speech caused boredom was perceived as a direct insult to the majesty. There is a known case where a senator named Marcus Appius yawned during a speech by Claudius about the expansion of the empire's borders, and he was immediately stripped of all. His privileges and his assets were confiscated in favor of the state. Interestingly, to combat involuntary yawning, the Romans developed an entire system of techniques. The speakers carried sharp pins with them and would prick themselves at moments of fatigue, and the listeners used aromatic oils. The intense smell of mint or rosemary stimulated and helped maintain concentration. Some even placed small stones under their tongues, which created discomfort and prevented the mouth from opening involuntarily. Can you imagine this scene? An important Senate meeting is taking place. An influential politician is speaking, and meanwhile, a senator begins to yawn widely. The guard immediately grabs the offender and removes them from the room. And the next day, all of Rome is discussing this scandal. Modern historians believe that this law precisely contributed indirectly to the development of Roman oratory art. After all, if your speech is so boring that it causes the listeners to yawn, not only are you a bad speaker, but you are also exposing them to the danger of being punished. That's why the rhetoricians of the time made incredible efforts to make their presentations brilliant and captivating. In our time, such a law seems the height of absurdity, but it perfectly illustrates how seriously the ancient Romans treated matters of public etiquette and political reputation. Let's now move to medieval France in the 13th century. In the court of King Louis Napoleon, there was an astonishing law that prohibited smiling during meals. It would seem that what could be more natural than a smile at the table? But this prohibition had its logic. King Louis, nicknamed the Saint, was known for his devotion and asceticism. He considered that mealtime was not a moment for joy, but a time of reverent gratitude to God for the food provided. In his opinion, laughter and smiles at the table distracted from pious thoughts and demonstrated a lack of respect for divine gifts. Few know that this extravagant law was adopted after Louis's return from the Seventh Crusade, during which the king was captured by the Muslims and was forced to pay a huge ransom. Historians believe that it was precisely the experience of captivity, where food was scarce and the suffering immense, that shaped his special relationship with food as a sacred act. Every crumb of bread reminded him of those who went hungry, and every drop of wine the blood shed by the Crusaders. To comply with this strange prescription, a special position was created at the court, the food observer. His duties included watching the faces of the diners and reprimanding those who showed excessive joy. The chronicles preserve the name of one of these observers, Jean de Joinville, who, with manic rigor, monitored the compliance with the royal mandate and even kept a special diary of infractions. The courtiers who dined with the king had to maintain a serious expression on their faces, regardless of how tasty the dish was or how amusing it might be. The after-dinner conversation was meant to maintain a somber atmosphere during the meal. Excerpts from the lives of holy martyrs or stories about the sufferings of Christ were often read. Imagine, you are enjoying an exquisite dish and, meanwhile, they are telling you about the painful death of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows. It definitely doesn't improve the appetite. Imagine a royal dinner, a long table filled with exquisite delicacies where courtiers with stone faces sit, carefully avoiding even the hint of a smile, and the court jesters, whose job was to entertain the guests, had to refrain from their duties during the meal. There is an anecdotal case when the young Count of Blois couldn't contain his laughter upon seeing how the court's cat stole a piece of meat directly from the bishop's plate. For this breach of etiquette, he was ordered to spend 3 days in fasting and prayer, reflecting on the sufferings of the hungry. It's not too severe a punishment for a simple smile, but such were the customs of that time. Those who breached etiquette risked falling into disgrace, which, in those times, could have the most unfortunate consequences for one's career at court. The rule was observed with particular rigor during religious festivities and periods of fasting, when the atmosphere of sorrow and penance had to be felt even at the royal table. This law reflects not only the personal preferences of the monarch, but also the general attitude of medieval society towards food as a sacred act. In a time when hunger was a frequent phenomenon and food was considered a divine gift, laughter at the table could truly be perceived as a manifestation of ingratitude and frivolity. After the death of Louis the Saint, the law gradually lost its strength, although elements of this etiquette were preserved in the French court for several more centuries. It is curious that echoes of this tradition can be found in modern etiquette. It is considered bad manners to laugh with a full mouth or to show excessive emotion during an official dinner. The fourth absurd law takes us to Siam, the present-day Thailand of the 18th century. There existed perhaps one of the strangest prohibitions in the history of humanity. It was categorically forbidden to step on coins and banknotes. It would seem, who would even think of stepping on money on purpose? But this law had its own special logic. In Siam, the king, considered a divine figure, appeared on all monetary signs. Stepping on the image of the monarch meant committing not only an offense to majesty, but a true sacrilege. It is important to understand the cultural context. In Thai tradition, feet are considered the most impure part of the body, symbolically associated with the lower realms of being. Therefore, pointing the feet towards a person or sacred object is a grave insult, and stepping on the image of a deified ruler is a crime comparable to a direct attack on their life. The law was adopted during the reign of the king, Rama II, who sought to reinforce the sacred status of the monarchy after a series of political upheavals. It was believed that the connection between the king's image and his real person was so strong that any damage to the portrait could cause physical harm to the monarch himself. In the court chronicles, there is even a case described where the king suddenly felt pain in his leg. Right at the moment when somewhere in the province, a peasant accidentally stepped on a coin with his image. Violators of this law faced severe punishment, ranging from fines to imprisonment. In particularly serious cases, when malicious intent was detected, the culprit could be sentenced to public flogging or even the amputation of the foot, a symbolic punishment for desecrating the royal image with the foot. The law required citizens to immediately pick up any fallen coin or bill to prevent the accidental desecration of the royal image. Imagine what happened in the markets when someone accidentally dropped their purse. Everyone present would rush to pick up the scattered coins to avoid being accused of disrespecting the monarch. And if a coin rolled under a counter or into a hard-to-reach place, a real rescue operation would begin. Merchants even developed special devices to retrieve coins from narrow slots. To enforce this law, a special monetary police was created. Thank you. They patrolled the markets and crowded places. These guardians of order were equipped with long sticks with magnets on the end to extract coins from hard-to-reach places. Working in this unit was considered honorable but also dangerous. After all, if the guardian himself accidentally stepped on a coin, he could be accused of the very crime he was supposed to prevent. The law also created other curious situations. For example, thieves avoided stealing purses because during the escape the coins could fall out and stopping to pick them up. It meant being caught. Gambling with coins practically disappeared. It was too risky to throw money on the gaming table, and street musicians, who were traditionally tossed coins, began to use special rugs or cushions so that donations wouldn't fall to the ground. It's interesting that such an attitude towards the image of the monarch on monetary signs is still preserved in Thailand today. Although formally the prohibition of stepping on banknotes no longer exists, Thais still consider this action unacceptable and show great respect for the national currency. If you are ever in Thailand and accidentally drop a banknote, do not step on it to prevent it from being blown away by the wind. Instead, quickly bend down and pick it up. The local inhabitants will appreciate your respect for their cultural traditions, and if they see a banknote flying down the street, they will probably notice how the Thais run to chase it. It's not greed, but a show of respect for the king. This is a clear example of how historical laws can form cultural traditions that survive for centuries. The fifth law takes us to Victorian England of the 19th century, where there was a truly surprising prohibition. Men were not allowed to wear riding trousers without the corresponding license. Yes, you heard correctly. To wear a certain type of trousers, a special permit from the authorities was required. This strange law was related to the class structure of British society. Riding trousers, wide at the hips and narrow at the ankles, were initially part of the military uniform of cavalry officers and were considered a symbol of aristocratic origin. The history of this garment is quite curious. They were named after the British general Sir Henry Halifax, who in the 18th century introduced this style for his riders. The special shape of the trousers was intended to provide comfort while riding, but it quickly became a status symbol. The fact is that quality riding trousers were made from expensive leather or special fabric, with the addition of merino wool, which only wealthy people could afford. When this style began to become fashionable among representatives of the middle and lower classes, it caused concern among the elite of society. The aristocrats saw this as an attempt by the commoners to appropriate symbols of higher status. As a result, a law was enacted requiring civilians to obtain a special license to wear riding trousers. To obtain such permission, it was necessary to prove one's noble origin or special merits to the crown. The procedure for obtaining the license for riding trousers was absurdly complex. The candidate had to present a family tree of at least 3 generations, letters of recommendation from 2 peers of the kingdom, and pay a significant fee to the treasury. For military officers, there was a relaxation. They only needed confirmation of their rank and type of troop. Riders automatically received the right to wear professional attire. It is particularly curious that women were exempt from this law. Ladies of the middle classes could wear dresses with elements similar to riding trousers without any license. This created a paradoxical situation. The wife could wear the fashionable style, but her husband could not. Imagine a fashionable man of that era. Thank you. Who had to carry a document confirming his right to wear unusual trousers and special patrols. They even checked for the existence of such licenses at social events and in the city's upscale neighborhoods. To comply with this surprising law, a fashion police was created in London, a special unit that monitored adherence to the dress code in public places. The officers of this unit had to possess impeccable taste and knowledge of the subtleties of high fashion. They patrolled Hyde Park, the Opera Theatre, and other places frequented by the elite, looking for violators. An anecdotal case is known where a young banker was detained outside the theater for wearing riding pants without a license. He tried to prove that his pants were simply wide-cut special trousers. But the inspector was inflexible. The case went to court, where to determine the exact style of the pants, they had to call in experts from the fashion world. Offenders face fines and confiscation of the illegal clothing, and in case of repeat offenses, even brief imprisonment. The law was enforced with particular strictness during important social events, such as the races at Ascot or royal receptions. Statistics from the time show that during the 5 years the law was in effect, around 3,000 licenses were issued, and nearly 800 violations were recorded. Most of the offenders were representatives of the new class of industrialists and financiers who sought to externally align with society, to the aristocratic environment they were trying to integrate into. This law did not last long and was repealed at the end of the 19th century, when the fashion of riding breeches gradually disappeared among the civilian population. However, it left a notable mark on British culture. The expression, "man with a license for riding breeches," is sometimes still used in English as an ironic designation for a person who tries to appear more important than they really are. This law perfectly illustrates to what extent issues of status and social differences could be legislatively regulated in the classist society of the past. In our days, such attempts to control fashion legislatively seem ridiculous, but historians point out that similar mechanisms of social control existed in many cultures and eras. The sixth law takes us to the United States in the early 20th century, to the era of prohibition. In the city of Fort Madison, Iowa, perhaps the most contradictory law on our list was adopted. Firefighters were prohibited from extinguishing burning bars. Yes, while the entire city could be reduced to ashes, firefighters were ordered to stand aside and watch as the flames, devoured the drinking establishments. This absurd law was adopted in the midst of the fight against alcohol, when opponents of spirits used any means to destroy drinking establishments. The logic of the legislators was simple and terrible at the same time. If bars burned down without resistance from the fire services, the owners of such establishments would eventually give up their business. Few know that this law was adopted under the pressure of a powerful women's lobby. In the early 20th century precisely, women's organizations were the main driving force behind the fight for prohibition. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by the charismatic activist Carrie Nation, organized true crusades against drinking establishments. Carrie herself became known for storming into bars with a hatchet and smashing bottles and bars, earning her the nickname Carrie the Barrier. It's interesting that the law was adopted after a series of suspicious fires in the city's drinking establishments. Historians believe that many of these fires were the result of arson organized by activists of the temperance movement. Instead of investigating these crimes, the city council practically legalized their consequences by prohibiting firefighters from fighting the fire. In fact, it was the legalized destruction of private property under the pretext of fighting for morality. The law created a dangerous precedent, allowing authorities to apply protection selectively depending on the moral assessment of citizens' activities. What if tomorrow they prohibited extinguishing fires in the homes of people of a certain religion or political views? Naturally, this law posed a serious threat to the safety of the entire city. Fire rarely confines itself to a single building, and a fire in a bar could easily spread to neighboring buildings. The situation was especially dangerous in the city center, where the buildings were very close together. An unextinguished fire could destroy an entire block. The firefighters of Fort Madison found themselves in an impossible moral dilemma. On one hand, they had sworn to protect the city from fire. On the other, they were obliged to comply with the law. Many firefighters simply ignored this ordinance, citing their professional duty. Others followed the letter of the law but applied ingenious legal loopholes. For example, they would extinguish neighboring buildings with such zeal that the water would accidentally also fall on the burning bar. In the historical chronicles of Fort Madison, the story is preserved of a firefighter named Jenkins, who categorically refused to stand idly by when the Silver Horseshoe Bar caught fire. When they threatened him with dismissal, he uttered a phrase that became famous in the city. "Fire me, right now if you want, but I will not stand by and watch the city turn to ashes because of a stupid law." Other firefighters supported him, and in the end, the bar was saved, and Jenkins himself became a local hero. Imagine this scene: a bar in flames, firefighters gather around with all their equipment, but they only watch helplessly as the fire spreads because the law forbids them from acting. And next to them are the activists from the sobriety movement, applauding, seeing the fire as divine retribution for the sale of alcohol. The situation was especially absurd with the so-called multifunctional establishments. For example, if there was a bar and a hotel in a building, a legal case would arise. Curious. The firefighters had to extinguish the part of the building with the hotel, but they were not allowed to direct water jets at the bar facilities. In one case, they went to the extent that a team of firefighters literally sealed off the building to save the law-abiding part of the structure. Fortunately, this dangerous law did not last long. After several cases where fires actually spread to neighboring buildings, citizens demanded its repeal. The decisive incident occurred in October 1922 when the fire at Old Joe's Bar, spread to a neighboring elementary school. Fortunately, there were no classes that day and no one was injured, but the incident itself outraged the citizens. Due to a ridiculous law, children's lives were put in danger. After this incident, the city council met in an emergency session and unanimously repealed the outrageous ordinance. However, in the short time of its existence, it managed to cause significant damage and demonstrated how far authorities can go in their eagerness to impose certain behavioral norms on society. This law remains a dark stain in the history of American legislation, and a reminder that even good intentions, like the fight against alcoholism, can lead to absurd and dangerous decisions when ideology prevails over common sense. The seventh law takes us back to medieval Europe, specifically to 15th century Scotland. There, a law existed that prohibited commoners from wearing plaid clothing. Yes, the famous Scottish tartan, which today is associated with the national identity of all Scots, was once exclusively a privilege of noble families. The history of the tartan has roots in antiquity. Archaeological findings indicate that plaid fabrics were used in the territory of present-day Scotland as early as the 3rd century AD. However, precisely in the Middle Ages, tartan patterns acquired a special significance, becoming a visual code of belonging to a clan. Each clan had its unique pattern, determined by the combination of colors and the width of the lines. The colors were not chosen arbitrarily. They had a deep symbolic meaning. For example, green symbolized the connection with the forest and home, blue with lakes and rivers, red with blood and sacrifice in battle. The tartan was a kind of heraldry, except that instead of a shield with an emblem, the Scotsman wore his belonging directly on his body. According to the law adopted under King James III in 1471, only representatives of the nobility and members of certain clans had the right to wear clothing made of plaid fabric. For ordinary peasants and citizens, such clothing was strictly prohibited. Interestingly, the law provided for a gradation of punishments depending on the complexity and beauty of the pattern. For a simple two-color check, they could simply impose a fine, but for a tartan with a pattern, complex multicolor, the punishment was much more severe. Wearing the tartan of another clan was considered especially serious. This was seen as an act of espionage or preparation for identity theft. Offenders faced severe punishments, fines, whippings, and in case of repeat offenses, even the amputation of an ear. Imagine a world where the color and pattern of your clothing could cost you physical mutilation. In the city of Edinburgh, there was even a special prison for tartan criminals, people who illegally wore plaid clothing. Prisoners ironically called it the plaid cell. According to court records, during the 20 years the law was in effect, more than 2,000 offenders passed through this prison, most of whom were young people aspiring to imitate the Highland warriors. Behind this strange prohibition was a complex system of social hierarchy and clan relationships. Each tartan pattern was associated with a specific clan or family and was considered a kind of heraldic symbol. Wearing someone else's tartan was seen as an appropriation of privileges, foreign and status symbols. Something similar to the current forgery of a noble title or military decorations. The tartan also had a practical significance in military matters. During clan wars, which were a common phenomenon in medieval Scotland, warriors could instantly identify whether they had an ally or an enemy in front of them. If a commoner could freely wear any tartan, it would create chaos on the battlefield, battle and opportunities for espionage and sabotage. The law was observed with particular rigor at the borders of clan territories. Travelers crossing these borders were strongly advised to change into neutral clothing, or, in the worst case, wear the tartan of the clan whose lands they were traveling through. There are known cases where reckless travelers were killed simply for wearing the plaid of an enemy clan. Interestingly, after the suppression of the Jacobite uprising in 1746, the British authorities went even further and completely banned the use of tartan in Scotland for all strata of the population, considering it a symbol of separatism. This prohibition, known as the Dress Act of the Highlands, it was in effect for 36 years and was so strict that Scots who dared to wear the national dress could be deported to the colonies for a period of up to 7 years. Paradoxically, it was precisely this prohibition that ultimately transformed tartan from a symbol of disunity among clans into a symbol of Scottish unity and resistance to English influence. When the prohibition was finally repealed at the end of the 18th century, wearing tartan became an act of patriotism for all Scots, regardless of their social background. Since then, tartan has gradually transformed from a symbol of clan belonging to a symbol of Scottish identity, general, familiar to us today. In modern Scotland, there are more than 6,000 registered variants of tartan, including patterns for corporations, educational institutions, and even rock bands. But before creating a new tartan design, it must be registered in the registry. Scottish tartan an echo of those times when the checkered pattern could cost a person an ear. And finally, the eighth and possibly most well-known of the absurd laws from the past is the witch law, adopted in the colony of Salem, Massachusetts, at the end of the 17th century. According to this law, a person could be accused of witchcraft based on spectral evidence. Sounds like a phrase from a fantasy novel, doesn't it? But for the inhabitants of Salem, this was a completely real legal term. Spectral evidence consisted of testimonies that the accused supposedly appeared to the witness in the form of a ghost or vision, causing them suffering. In fact, it was enough to declare, "I saw the ghost of this person who tormented me last night," and this could be accepted by the court as proof of guilt. This surprising legal principle has its origin in the theological treatises of the English priest Richard Bernard, who claimed that the devil could not take the form of an innocent person without divine permission. Therefore, if someone saw the ghost of a specific person, this meant that the person had indeed made a pact with the devil. The logic was roughly this: if the accused were not a witch, God would not allow their image to appear in the form of a tormenting vision. The Puritans of Salem, known for their religiosity and strict morals, adopted this concept without hesitation and included it in local legislation. At the same time, there were no criteria to verify the truthfulness of such testimonies. The witness could simply declare a vision, and their word was taken as truth without material evidence. Without confirmation from other witnesses, only the subjective claim of a supernatural experience. It turns out that if you had a conflict with a neighbor, you could easily get rid of them by simply declaring that you saw their spectral image flying over your roof or tormenting your children. Particularly vulnerable to such accusations were the socially unprotected categories of the population, such as elderly, solitary women, representatives of ethnic minorities, people with peculiar physical characteristics or mental disorders. There is a known case of a woman named Sarah Good who was accused of witchcraft, partly because she had the habit of murmuring to herself, which her neighbors perceived as the casting of spells. Exemplary. There is the case of Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer accused of witchcraft based on spectral evidence. He refused to plead guilty or innocent, understanding that, in any case, his assets would be confiscated. To force him to speak, the judges applied the cruel torture of pressing. Heavy stones were placed on Corey's chest, gradually increasing the weight. According to eyewitnesses, before dying, the old man only uttered, "More weight," either demanding to end his torment with death or showing his contempt towards the judges. This law paved the way for the infamous Salem witch trials, which resulted in the execution of 19 people, and another one died under torture. Consider, in the modern world, no court would take seriously the statement, "I dreamed that this person committed a crime." But in Salem, in the late 17th century, such accusations could lead a person to the gallows. Psychologists and sociologists still study the phenomenon of the Salem trials, seeking explanations for the mass hysteria that gripped the colony. Among the possible causes mentioned are ergot poisoning, a fungus that affects rye and causes hallucinations, internal conflicts within the community, struggles for land resources, and even psychological peculiarities of adolescents who more frequently acted as victims of witchcraft. Especially tragic was the case of Rebecca Nurse, a respected 70-year-old parishioner known for her piety. When she was accused of witchcraft, many residents spoke in her defense, gathering 80 signatures in a petition regarding her innocence. The jury even issued an initial verdict of not guilty. But, under the judge's pressure, they were forced to reconsider their decision. Rebecca was executed at the gallows, and before dying she declared, "I am innocent of the crime. I am accused of as any unborn child." Today in Salem, a monument stands for Rebecca Nurse as a symbol of the innocent victims of judicial arbitrariness. Fortunately, just a year after the start of the Salem hysteria, the colonial authorities realized the absurdity of the situation and annulled the admissibility of spectral evidence in the courts. The governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, dissolved the special court for witchcraft cases and pardoned all the remaining accused. In 1711, the colonial parliament passed a law that annulled all the guilty verdicts from that period and paid compensation to the families of the victims. And in 1957, the state of Massachusetts officially apologized for the witch trials, acknowledging them as a result of fear caused by ignorance and superstition. After almost 300 years, justice finally prevailed. But during the brief period when this law was in effect, it managed to ruin many lives and become one of the darkest examples of how absurd legal norms can lead to tragic consequences. The case of the Salem witches is still studied in law schools as a classic example of how not to build a judicial system. Thus, we have examined 8 absurd laws from different times and cultures. What unites all these strange legislative acts? Above all, they all reflect the values, fears, and prejudices of their time. The prohibition of dying in Parliament was related to the feudal right of property, the prohibition of yawning with Roman ideas about political etiquette, and the witch hunts in Salem with religious fears of the Puritan community. Upon closer examination, it becomes evident that many of these laws had a rational seed, but were taken to the absurd. The prohibition of stepping on money in Siam was a manifestation of respect for the monarch, only expressed in an extreme form. The prohibition of using tartan by certain strata of the population reflected the actual social structure of Scottish society. Even the law on spectral evidence was a logical consequence of the Puritans' deep faith in the reality of the afterlife and the omnipresence of Satan. These laws also demonstrate how often legislation was used not only to maintain order, but also to reinforce the social hierarchy and the privileges of certain groups. The prohibitions on wearing riding pants or tartan were instruments to maintain class differences, and the prohibition of extinguishing burning bars, a means to impose certain morals on the entire society. Another interesting characteristic of many absurd laws is their resilience. Some remained in force for decades and even centuries despite their absurdity. This speaks to the incredible inertia of legal systems and how difficult it sometimes is for society to recognize that a decision made at the time was wrong. Modern jurists call this phenomenon legal fossil. Laws continue to exist long after the causes that generated them have disappeared. According to legal research, today there are thousands of obsolete laws in the world that have not been formally repealed. In British legislation, rules from the 13th century can still be found, and in some states of the USA, are there still laws in force from the colonial era? For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, it is technically still illegal to sing in the bathtub, and in Alabama, playing dominoes on Sundays. Finally, these examples show how relative our ideas about rationality and justice are. What seemed completely logical to our ancestors today causes us perplexity and laughter. Perhaps, in several centuries our descendants will be equally surprised by some modern laws that seem quite reasonable to us. What does this say about us and our society? Above all, that laws are not immutable truths carved in stone, but a reflection of current social norms, values, and commitments evolving along with society, and what was considered a necessary restriction yesterday may be perceived as a ridiculous anachronism today. Psychologists, thank you. Point out that studying the absurd laws of the past helps us develop critical thinking, and to realize that many self-evident truths of our time may simply be cultural constructs without objective value. This makes us more open to change and less dogmatic in our beliefs. Jurists and legislators also draw lessons from the history of absurd laws. Many modern legal systems and justice include mechanisms for periodic review of legislation to identify and eliminate obsolete or non-functional norms. For example, in the Netherlands, There is the practice of legislative guillotine, the automatic repeal of laws that have not been reviewed for a certain period. The study of absurd laws from the past also reminds us of the importance of critical thinking and the willingness to review established norms. If the inhabitants of Salem had doubted more about the reasonableness of spectral evidence and the citizens of Fort Madison had opposed, before, the prohibition of putting out bars on fire could have prevented many tragedies and destructions. Ultimately, the history of absurd laws teaches us humility, reminding us that our own legal and moral ideas are not an absolute truth and may seem as ridiculous to future generations as prohibitions on yawning or smiling at the table seem to us. This invites us to be more attentive to what restrictions we impose on ourselves and others, and to constantly ask ourselves, will today's reasonable measure not become tomorrow's anecdote? With this, our journey through the strange pages of legal history concludes. I hope these 8 absurd laws have not only entertained you but also made you reflect on the nature of legislation and its connection with society. In future episodes, we will continue exploring surprising historical curiosities that help us better understand both the past and the present. Perhaps we will tackle absurd medical practices, strange fashion trends, or ridiculous superstitions that were once taken very seriously. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, count on me. Which law did you find the most ridiculous? Or perhaps you know of other strange laws worth discussing in future episodes. See you soon in the world of surprising facts and stories.